Also, to be aware of the risks of some of these new technologies, because everything that's new, all new technologies come with benefits and risks which need to be balanced. And therefore, countries, ministries, the public need to be aware and need to be able to deal with those ethical, social, legal, and regulatory aspects of these new technologies, like genome editing or artificial intelligence. All of these are amazingly beneficial for health, but also have some downsides. And the second major goal of the science division is really to ensure that there is a quality assurance process that goes into all our work. And it's not that it wasn't there before, but really the idea was to bring much more focus into making sure that not only is our guidance scientifically excellent, technically excellent, and the best that it could be, but also that it's relevant, it's answering the needs of people on the ground who are grappling with a number of challenges in our member states. It's timely, and it's delivered in a way that is easy for people to adopt and implement. So, for example, we're trying to move to computable guidelines now, also living guidelines, so that we're constantly updating, and it's not 5 or 10 years that you have to wait before we do a new set of paper books on guidelines. So they're making many, many changes, and the idea really is to translate knowledge as soon as possible. First of all, to capture new knowledge, and then to translate it into policy, into practice at the country level. And this is where the 3 levels of the organization have to work very closely together. So that's just a brief introduction. And we've played a big role now in this COVID response as well. The science division's really been in the center of it.
Thank you, Soumya. I think we are ready to take questions. I see that Jamil wants to ask the first question. Jamil, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly. Go ahead, Jamil.
Yes, thank you for this opportunity, Fadela and Dr. Soumya. My question is about, and apologies for bringing this back to the issue, but chloroquine. The fact that yesterday we had an announcement that was a little bit confusing, to be honest, from the outside world. First, if you could explain exactly what are the next steps in terms of this, because it was said yesterday that it's not a WHO statement, but what does that mean? That at one point you're going to go back, or what is it? And secondly, on the same issue, Brazil insists that it will not only continue giving it, but it will even broaden the use of this medicine. Do you recommend what Brazil is doing? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that question. Let me try to explain. So, from the beginning of this pandemic, we had this Research and Innovation Forum in February, where we brought together the world's leading scientists and academics to develop a research roadmap for COVID-19. And the focus was on understanding more about the virus and its natural history and transmission and epidemiology, but also on trying to develop as rapidly as possible treatments and diagnostics, and then, of course, vaccines. Now, when it came to treatments, what was done early on was to look at existing drugs, because it's much easier to take existing drugs which are already safe for use in humans, which are licensed in countries, which can be used rapidly, and test to see if it has any activity against this new pathogen. And therefore, a number of drugs which have been used for other diseases, including many antiviral drugs, like anti-HIV drugs and anti-influenza drugs, but also drugs like hydroxychloroquine, which in the past have shown activity against other viruses in lab settings, were looked at. And there were some early signs that hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine had some activity in suppressing viral replication in the lab. And then some early reports that came out of China that suggested that it may have some beneficial effects. These were small case series. So our expert group looked at a huge range of drugs and recommended 4 or 5 of them which are worth testing in clinical trials. And that's how the Solidarity trial had 4 arms. So it had hydroxychloroquine, it had remdesivir, which is a new antiviral drug that's been tested for Ebola before. Lopinavir-ritonavir combination is anti-HIV drug, and also lopinavir-ritonavir with interferon 1 beta. So this trial started at the end of March, and so far has recruited about 4,500 patients. I think it's an incredible accomplishment to have launched a trial in 20 countries at hundreds of hospitals with so many participating physicians and patients. Now, what happens in a clinical trial is it's a randomized. So you have a central randomization unit which runs out of here, out of Geneva, and a physician in a participating hospital has to fill out a short form, all electronic. There's no paper involved. They have to answer a set of, first they have to be registered as a participant, then they answer some questions. Then the information comes to the randomization center and a code is sent to them. The code tells them which drug to use. So it's randomly done across the world. And there were many other trials, of course, going on, also using hydroxychloroquine and others. Especially the largest trial is the UK's recovery trial, which till now has enrolled 11,000 patients. So what happened is that about 10 days ago, the recovery trial actually looked at their data. They did an interim data analysis, and their data safety monitoring board suggested that there is no benefit because they had enrolled enough numbers to be able to analyze hydroxychloroquine versus those who had standard of care, and they said that there was no benefit in mortality seen, which was the endpoint used. So the UK recovery trial and the WHO solidarity trial use very similar, almost identical protocols because it was developed by WHO group of experts and then adopted by recovery. So it's easy actually to compare the results from these two. And so at the same time, we also, our data safety monitoring committee, an independent committee, looked at the interim data from our trial, and we found that there was no mortality benefit in the patients receiving hydroxychloroquine compared to the control arm. So the UK's recovery trial and the solidarity trial, if you really put them together, the large number of patients where there's no benefit. And so it was decided that there was no point in continuing. It's what we call futility. When you are convinced that there is no benefit, then you do not keep on continuing. That's one of the principles of clinical trials. And that was the way our trial was set up, to be an adaptive trial. So the steering group, which advises the trial, and the DSMC, which provided the data, decided that there was, the steering group took the decision, the executive group took the decision that this arm should be dropped. Now what are we doing? We're looking at the interim results of another arm, which is the lopinavir-ritonavir arm, to see whether there's any signal there, because the recovery trial also has this drug in their, and they again enrolled a large number of patients. As a global community, what do we want? We want clear answers to these questions. We want to know whether a drug reduces mortality or not. And if it doesn't, does it have any other beneficial effects like reducing hospitalization or the need for ventilation? If those benefits are there, then we want patients to get it. But if there aren't, we want everybody to know that there's no point in continuing. So we have the same situation with lopinavir-ritonavir now, which we will be looking at, and then deciding on whether we should change the other arms in the trial. But we will come to that later. Now, you asked an important question about policy, and that there was some confusion. I think the decision about hydroxychloroquine is limited to the use in the solidarity trial. Treatment guidelines are made slightly differently. Treatment guidelines are not based on interim results of one trial. We look at all the evidence that's out there. We do what is called a pooled analysis or a meta-analysis. And then there's a guideline development group that's already set up for COVID-19, which will look at the consolidated evidence on hydroxychloroquine, on lopinavir-ritonavir, on remdesivir, on dexamethasone, and make recommendations as to whether people should use it or not use it. Where there's a lack of evidence, we say there is still a lack of evidence and we're waiting for more trials. As far as the use of hydroxychloroquine for prophylaxis or prevention of COVID-19, either before or after exposure, the last word is not yet out. I think there are some good and big trials going on, and we hope those will be completed so that we will have the kind of evidence that we need to make sure that patients receive the drugs which help and do not receive drugs which do not help. There are countries which have made their own national guidelines and they are free to do so. We have what is called off-label use of drugs. We have a scientific brief on our website which describes how can countries use drugs which are not yet indicated for a particular purpose. So that they have that degree of freedom, but hopefully all countries will have evidence-based guidelines. As more and more evidence becomes available, these treatment guidelines should be refined to reflect the state of knowledge and the state of science.
Thank you, Soumya. Now we will go to Bloomberg. I think we have two reporters, Corinne and Thomas. Maybe we start with Corinne.
Yes, thank you. Where does this outbreak rank in the pantheon of pandemics? Is this, or does it have the potential to be, the most devastating outbreak in the last century?
We're still in the middle of it. We don't know where we are. In fact, it's only been 6 months since it started. It certainly looks like it's one of the most serious challenges that we've had in global health in the last century. I don't think anybody alive today has lived through a true pandemic, which is what we're into. So none of us can afford to take it lightly. We hope that because we're living 100 years from 1918, which was the last flu pandemic, which killed, millions and millions of people around the world, science has advanced a lot. And to think of the fact that you can have vaccines made within 2 months of a genetic sequence of a new virus being released and into human clinical trial, that was unimaginable. There were no drugs or vaccines in 1918. So I hope the world can use its resources and scientists in a way, public and private sector, in a way that we can actually interrupt the natural course of this pandemic, which seems to be very, very serious, the way it's spreading around the world. So I think we have that opportunity where human beings can now intervene. But at the same time, we always say the virus is smart, this virus is dangerous. We should not underestimate this virus. So we have to keep an eye on what it's doing as well.
Thank you, Dr. Swaminathan. We move now to Lisa Schlein, Voice of America. Lisa, can you hear us? Lisa?
Yeah, I've unmuted myself now. Thanks, Fidela. Nice to hear from you. I can never pronounce the name of the drug. Hexachloroquine, right?
Hydroxychloroquine.
Whatever. A follow-up to Jamil's question, and then another, my own question. All right. I understand there is so much conflicting information about the trials that have gone on. You've explained some of this, but I understand there is a big trial underway with many nurses in different countries about the use of this drug as a preventive measure. Is that correct? I mean, does this seem like it's actually is something that might work, that could be available? I mean, is this something that you think is important, this particular research? And then I have a follow-up question in that currently, how many vaccines and drugs are under research, and how many of them are promising? And one more question on this is, there is so much conflicting conjecture about Will the vaccine be available at the end of the year? Maybe it'll be next year, maybe it'll take 2 years. What's your guess? You're a scientist, so you don't guess. So what is your actual factual information that you have on this? Thank you.
Thank you. A set of interesting questions. Thank you for those. Just to finish up with the hydroxychloroquine, yes, you're right. There are a couple of large randomized trials going on to test hydroxychloroquine as a prophylactic or a preventive in healthcare workers and in others who are exposed to the virus. Now, what is clear now is hydroxychloroquine does not seem to have, or does not have, we know for sure now, does not have an impact on the disease course, on mortality in hospitalized COVID-19 patients. Where there is still a gap is, does it have any role at all in prevention or in minimizing the severity of the illness in early infection or even in preventing infection? We don't know that as yet. And we need to complete those large trials and get the data. So again, we have a definitive answer on that. So I hope that those trials will be completed. The question on therapeutics and vaccines, yes. So we are tracking the drugs that are being tested, evaluated across the world. We maintain a database. Many other people are doing that. There are also groups that are continuously updating the evidence on a particular drug or a group of drugs, and we link that also in our website. It's very good that so many efforts are going on around the world. What we would like to encourage is more of randomized clinical trial evidence, if possible, in large enough numbers to have conclusive proof. What happened in the early stages of this pandemic, and it's natural, I think everyone was trying to do their best in the given circumstances. You had a number of small studies coming out, which perhaps contributed a little bit towards the confusion that has arisen, because one study would say, yes, it seems to be working. The next study would say, no, it doesn't work at all. But we're talking about small numbers, 50, 100, 200 at the most. Those are not definitive. And that now we have these large trials going on, which hopefully can answer. And some of the trials have been set up in a way that we can keep adding more drugs to be tested. So, for example, the WHO Solidarity trial has now asked its expert group to look at what are the drugs that seem to be on the horizon that are early in development, which could then be included once we finish, the existing arms and we have the evidence. Monoclonal antibodies, for example, there are several now coming into the clinical stages of testing. There are other drugs being developed in universities and small biotech companies around the world. There are also, this disease is a viral infection, but it also seems to stimulate an immune response, which can be damaging. So the mortality quite often is because of the overproduction of inflammatory substances in the body, cytokines and others, which damage the lung and which attack other parts of other organs as well. So there is a role also for immune modulators, for drugs that modulate the immune response. So you have antiviral drugs, you have these immune modulator drugs, and then you have a class of antibodies. There are trials going on now on convalescent plasma. You take the plasma or the blood from people who have recovered from the illness, who have antibodies, and transfuse that into a person with illness. Again, the clinical trials have not been completed, but it's a similar principle. But monoclonal antibodies are more specific. They're more targeted to the part of the virus that actually attaches to the cell receptor. So you can be much more targeted, and you could actually use it even as a preventative till a vaccine is developed. So there are many exciting opportunities now for testing of those. Turning to vaccines, again, huge activity in this field. We have every day the number increases, but there are at least 200 plus vaccine candidates at some stage of development. But the ones that are the furthest along, there are about 10 candidates now which are in human testing. And, we go through phase 1, 2, and 3. 3 of those are entering phase 3 very soon in the next couple of weeks. So there's the AstraZeneca, the Oxford Chadox vaccine. There's the Moderna's RNA vaccine that will be tested by the NIH. And then there is a Chinese vaccine. In fact, there are a couple of Chinese vaccine candidates that are showing some promising results in phase 1 and 2 that are ready to go into phase 3. So we're entering a new phase now of vaccine trials, the phase 3 trials, which are the ones that will definitively prove whether a vaccine is efficacious and safe. I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic, but vaccine development is a complex undertaking. It comes with a lot of uncertainty. The good thing is we have many different vaccine candidates and platforms. So even if the first one fails or the second fails, we shouldn't lose hope. We shouldn't give up. There are DNA vaccines, RNA vaccines, inactivated vaccines, protein subunit vaccines, and viral vectored vaccines. Every possible platform has been tried by some company or the other. So we do have a very good pipeline. And again, this is where WHO wants to work with companies, with sponsors. And as you know, we have the ACT accelerator now. And the vaccine pillar, we're working closely with CEPI and Gavi. And the idea really is to accelerate the development of as many vaccine candidates as possible, at least the ones that look promising initially, take them through testing. Also, scale up manufacturing. What we invest in manufacturing even before we know the vaccine will be successful, so that the moment you have your results from the phase 3, you're also able to produce a large number of vaccines. So if we are very lucky, there will be 1 or 2 successful candidates before the end of this year. But till we see the results of those trials, and the trials are also difficult to do because you have to do them in places where there's infection going on. So, for example, if you have a country that's developed a vaccine, but they've been able to control their infection rates, they necessarily have to look for other places for testing. And this is where, again, the global collaboration becomes important. Till we have vaccines and till we have good preventive tools, we must and we have to follow the public health measures that WHO has been repeatedly emphasizing. The make sure you're testing everybody who's symptomatic, isolating them, providing them care. Our clinical management is getting better and better as we're learning about this disease. So you can actually reduce death by early detection of people, making sure they're in medical facilities where they can be monitored, that oxygen is available. And then, of course, doing the contact tracing and the quarantining, reducing the transmission within the community, the physical distancing, the masking where physical distancing is not possible, the hand hygiene, the respiratory hygiene. We mustn't forget these are the very basic ones that have actually helped many countries that have been able to control it. And hopefully once we get a vaccine, then we can relax on some of those, but not for the next foreseeable future anyway.
Thank you, Dr. Swaminathan. We have a lot of journalists lining up. We will take the next question from Gabriela. Gabriela?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I would like to know how are you going to reconcile the issue of in talking about vaccines on intellectual property and access to vaccines in all countries. I can understand that scientists who discover the vaccine will want to be recognized for that. I mean, it's going to be like the discovery of the century. But yeah, I have these questions on that. And then if you can recommend something to strengthen the immune system, not treat COVID, but I mean, for people to be stronger in case that they got the infection, like vitamins or something like that. And the third question is, if you are familiar with the use of tocilizumab, apparently in Mexico, it's giving a good results. So I don't know if there are clinical trials or if you're familiar with this medicine. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I forgot the first one. Let me start with tocilizumab.
It's the patent issue.
The patent issue. We'll come to that. So, the tocilizumab is an IL-6 inhibitor. There are other such what we call the biologic products, which are acting against the inflammatory molecules. I mentioned that part of the reason why this becomes severe and leads to death in some people is that there's a huge inflammatory response of the body, and we're still trying to understand like why some people go into that phase. But anyway, so to want to ramp down that inflammation, people are trying drugs like tocilizumab. It's in clinical trials. Yes, there's anecdotal evidence that it seems to help, but we're waiting for the results, and I think there will be some results coming out both on tocilizumab and other such drugs which have been tried. In fact, dexamethasone is an anti-inflammatory drug which we've had for decades. It's an old drug, corticosteroid. It's a known anti-inflammatory used in many diseases. So that is why the results of the recovery trial were quite encouraging and quite surprising, that this drug actually reduced mortality by about 30% in the most severely ill patients on mechanical ventilation. So it's a broad spectrum anti-inflammatory. Some of these other drugs are more narrowly focused on against one cytokine. Now, about the patent issue, I mean, I think this is a very, very important, relevant question that you've asked. The model of innovation today is a market-driven model. And WHO has been saying for quite some time that it has failed public health because we've been unable to develop drugs and vaccines for diseases for which there is no commercial value. And so we've said for many years that we need to change this model. We need to think of other ways of doing research and development, which is more focused on public good and public health. Health isn't something that necessarily has to, or should not be something that, works on a market forces or on a basis of monetization. And therefore, I hope that now, for this pandemic, there's been a huge solidarity in a way, both from the private and the public sector, certainly from scientists across the world. There's been no holding back. It's been open sharing, open knowledge, data being put out as soon as it's available. And many of the vaccine manufacturers also saying that they would like to supply the vaccines at cost or on a not-for-profit basis. We also need to come together now and that's why this ACT accelerator was set up, and the COVAX facility that's been set up is mainly for people and countries to come together to pool the resources in one place, because what that allows you to do is you pool your risk. You don't know which vaccine candidate is going to be successful. And so if a country puts all their resources into one vaccine candidate and it's not successful, then basically that country will be left with very little choice. Whereas if you pool your resources into a common pot that is able to fund a number of candidates, and a couple of them hopefully will be successful, then you can also have more negotiating power on prices and have a procurement mechanism which is fair and equitable. So WHO is working on a fair allocation mechanism, which we're discussing with our member states to see, can countries all come to an agreement on how you share a limited supply of vaccine. Let's say you have 50 or 100 million doses at the end of this year. Okay, how should the world share that? Should it go only to the countries which have paid for it or are capable of paying for it to cover their own populations? Or should it go to protect frontline health workers or the most vulnerable people, whether they are the elderly or whether they are people with other diseases? And certainly frontline workers, health workers, but also other kinds of first responders are at the highest risk, as we've seen, unfortunately. We've seen huge numbers of frontline workers getting infected in many, many countries. So this is something I think the global community needs to discuss, and member states will be discussing this at the WHO meetings that we have every week with them, and hopefully will come to support a framework that's fair, that's equitable. And I think the patent issue is not such a big issue, because you can have different ways in which the patents can be shared, different forms of licensing. I think the issue is more about making sure we have enough capacity to manufacture those vaccines around the world, and a way of sharing them and distributing them, which is fair. To come to very briefly your point on immunity, the basic, what we call innate immunity is something that our body has and which it uses to fight any new attack on us, whether it's a virus or it's a non-specific response. And how do you strengthen that? You strengthen that through good nutrition, good diet, taking enough physical exercise, avoiding tobacco, avoiding alcohol. So basically all the things we say, which keep you healthy. Mental stability and peace is also important. This is a time when all of us are under tremendous stress. And so we must do something which makes us relax a bit. For some people, it's physical exercise. For some people, it's meditation. It could be yoga. It could be a number of different things. That's why I don't like to use the word social distancing, and I prefer the word physical distancing, because socially we must connect and we must support each other. So I think that's the way in which you boost your immunity. Mood has a lot to do with immunity. Neuroscientists have clearly recognized the connection between your mental and your physical state. And so it's important to focus on both.
Thank you, Soumya. We will go now to Bodhi. Can you hear us? Please don't forget to unmute yourselves. Thank you, Bodhi. Phoenix Television, Chinese.
Okay.
Bodhi? I think that Bodhi is not... yeah? Okay. Yeah. Bonjour, Bodhi. Go ahead, please.
For me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for... So, Doctor, I remember last interview, Phoenix TV from Hong Kong. I remember last interview with you, you mentioned or evaluated that probable after 12 months, the vaccination trial and safety monitoring will finish. In terms of vaccines mass production and manufacturing productivity, and this distribution, that is all big challenges ahead of R&D.
Yes.
My question will be, who should get priority to get to given the vaccines, and how should it get delivery? And will WHO have a future plan to coordinate with all the issues? Thank you.
Thank you. That's really a very important question and something I'd referred to earlier. So the three partners, that's WHO, CEPI and Gavi, that are working on the vaccines pillar of the accelerator, the ACT accelerator. Our goal is to accelerate the development of the vaccines, but also to ensure fair and equitable access. But we can only do that if the world comes together, that countries come together and agree to this mechanism. So we are proposing a framework that could be used to decide who should be prioritized. And I mentioned that there could be, you could think about groups of people who should be prioritized. You think of one group of people who are at the front line, your drivers and ambulance workers and other healthcare workers, of course, doctors and nurses, but also the police and others who do your the grocery store, the sanitation workers. These are people who are exposed a lot. So you might want to protect them. There's another group of people who are at risk because they are vulnerable to more severe disease. They are the elderly, above 65, people who have hypertension, diabetes, obesity, dementia, chronic respiratory disease or chronic kidney disease. We know that they are the ones at high risk of death. You might want to protect them. And then you might want to protect people who are in situations which are high transmission settings. We've seen in the US the meat factory workers. We've seen outbreaks in prisons. We've seen outbreaks in nursing care homes. We've seen outbreaks in urban slums. And therefore, in every country, there are some high-risk situations where things can the clusters, start spreading very quickly. So these are the three groups that we think about prioritizing, and then we've done some calculations to see how many millions of each group there are. You have to start, I think, with the most vulnerable and then progressively vaccinate more people. The goals of vaccination are for individual and public health. So you want to reduce mortality and illness in the community. But the second major goal is to revive economies and get people back, societies back to normal functioning. For that, you need to vaccinate larger numbers of, including healthy adults. So you would progressively expand the number of people vaccinated depending on how many doses you have. We're hoping that in 2021 that we will have 2 billion doses of one or two or three effective vaccines to be distributed around the world. There's a big if there, because we don't yet have any vaccine that's proven. But because of all the investments going into this, let's say we will have 2 billion doses by the end of 2021. We should be able to vaccinate at least these priority populations. But WHO will propose these solutions. Member states, countries need to agree and need to come to a consensus. That's the only way that this can work. And next week you will hear more about the COVAX facility that's being set up by the three organizations and many partners around the world, which can enable such a thing to happen, because you pool resources and you also then are able to procure large volume of vaccines to distribute.
Thank you, Soumya. We will take a next question from Christian, DPA. Christian, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly. Go ahead, please.
Yes. Dr. Soumya, so many groups and companies are racing to find this vaccine. Are you not afraid that corners will be cut when it comes to safety, and how do you manage that risk? Because we all want that vaccine, but one put on the market that then shows to have unwanted side effects or worse. That would be a calamity in a world where many people are against vaccines already. How do you manage that risk? Thank you.
Thank you for that. You've raised a very, very important point. The public will want to know this because of the rapid speed at which things are being done. Is it possible to compromise on safety? And I think the answer is a clear no. So we're definitely engaging in discussions now with the developers of vaccines and others who are going to be sponsoring the trials to make sure that we have standard endpoints and data collection mechanisms where you evaluate both the efficacy, so how effective a vaccine is, and safety. Now, a clinical trial, a phase 3 clinical trial would normally be done in tens of thousands. You may have 20, 30,000 people in a clinical trial, and that should be good enough to tell you about efficacy and also safety, in the sense that any side effects which are quite common will be picked up. However, we know from past experience that sometimes after you start using a vaccine on much larger numbers, like hundreds of thousands of people, this goes for drugs as well, you may pick up very rare side effects that are not seen in tens of thousands but become obvious when you start vaccinating in hundreds or millions. So two things we do for that. One is what is called the surveillance, which means that once you start vaccinating larger populations, you still have a system in place to record those adverse events or side effects and be able to report them and analyze them. And this is how you determine the benefit-risk ratio. There is nothing in the world which is zero risk. You have to balance the benefits, what you're getting by protecting people from this infection, by stopping the pandemic, against the potential side effects that could happen. And of course, we hope that the vaccine will be as safe as possible, that there'll be no side effects at all. But this can be determined over a period of time. And so it's really important for us to have those mechanisms in place in countries where the vaccine is being introduced, to be able to study that even after it's passed its initial clinical trial. So I think scientists around the world agree that accelerating the timeline does not mean compromising or taking shortcuts on safety. That cannot be done. And therefore, all the results from these vaccine trials will be examined very, very closely and carefully by WHO, but also by regulators like the FDA and the EMA and so on, before a decision is made to actually license a vaccine.
Thank you, Dr. Soumya. Now we go to John Zaracostas. John, can you hear us? John? Can you unmute yourself, please?
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, good. Good morning. I would like to go back to the question of the potential candidate vaccines. Of the 2 or 3 that are in your more advanced stage on phase 3, which of the 3 would be able to be mass produced faster? I understand, I don't want to mention the brand, one of the candidates, the CEO has mentioned that up to 2 billion vaccines could be produced by this company alone. You mentioned earlier that you hope to have 2 billion vaccines by the end of 2021. This company claims that they can have 2 billion vaccines on their own. So if you could elaborate on the candidates and which is the potential to expedite and accelerate the production, and where do you bring in producers in developing countries which have the technology as well, like India, Vietnam, Thailand, Brazil, etc., Cuba?
Yes. Thank you for that, John. That's a great question. And again, we're working on a number of assumptions here. So I want to be very careful that we're not sure or committing to certain numbers or certain timelines, because it's all based on assumptions and knowledge that is changing all the time. Now, of course, we keep reading in the news about the claims that are made by various companies, both in terms of their results, which sometimes are released through press releases, but not yet in peer-reviewed journals. And we always wait to see those results, but also about the manufacturing capabilities and so on. Now, of course, for the larger companies, it is in a way easier for them to make these projections because they know what their manufacturing capacities are, and many of them have also invested in manufacturing facilities in different parts of the world, including the countries that you mentioned. So there are already tie-ups going on with companies which would do some of the manufacturing for these large companies. There are vaccines like the RNA vaccines, which apparently are quite easy to manufacture and scale. But we know that till date, we've not had an RNA or a DNA vaccine that's been used at all in humans for any disease. So this would be a new one, so would go through rigorous testing schedules. So for the purposes of the procurement and distribution, the fair allocation, we're working on the assumption that we may have a couple of 100 million doses at the end of this year, very optimistically, and a much larger volume, as I said, in the billions of doses in 2021, based on what we're hearing from the different manufacturers. And the COVAX group, the vaccines pillar of the accelerator, is working very closely with both the IFPMA, the International Federation of the Pharmaceutical Manufacturing Associations, which is all the large vaccine manufacturers, and also the DCVMN, the Developing Country Vaccine Manufacturers Association, which has a huge capacity and capability for manufacturing, is also doing innovation. And we're also looking very closely at the innovation that's coming out of some of these countries. They may be a little further behind, but you could have some good results coming from those. So this is why we need this exercise of the bodies sitting together. We meet every week to review what's happening, what's coming up, what the results are. The pharmaceutical companies are telling us also about the challenges and what they're seeing as in their own community. So this is going to be evolving all the time. And I think the next few months are going to be both interesting and challenging, because we're going to start seeing some results coming out from the phase 2s and deciding which ones. So one thing that WHO is doing along with our partners is setting up a committee now that will look very carefully at all of these vaccine candidates and make some recommendations for further investments, because we need to have some criteria which look, of course, at the science of the vaccine candidate, but also at the public health applicability. And so we want to set up a committee that will use these criteria that we've already developed, and the target product profiles also that have been developed by WHO expert committees to further prioritize investments in both research and development, but also in procurement. Ultimately, there'll be large procurements done by the COVAX facility, and that needs to be based also on clear guidance. And it relates to the previous question that was being asked also about safety and when do you actually, when are you satisfied and confident that a vaccine is safe and efficacious for widespread use.
Thank you, Soumya. We have two. I will take the last two questions. One from Gunilla, and the last one from Kate Killand. Gunilla, you have the floor.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for this occasion, this possibility for us to ask questions. I have one follow-up question to Christian's. It concerns safety. You say there should be no compromise on safety, but wasn't that what happened in the case of pandemics that was used in the influenza some years ago, and that created hundreds of cases of narcolepsy in the Nordic countries where young people live with this disease for life? So how will you be able to convince people when they're going to rush for a vaccine to actually dare to take it after having this experience with pandemics? And my second question is, how worried are you that when you have billions of vaccines being produced, that the virus have actually mutated, so they're no longer efficient? You have to start from scratch. I mean, is vaccine really the solution to this pandemic? Thank you.
Those are very deep questions, very tough questions. But just to go back to the issue of the safety, I think it's really important that scientists also are able to communicate well, because of the environment that where there are a number of people who also spread a lot of misinformation and rumors about vaccines. So we have now a community which is already questioning, the need for a COVID vaccine, even before we have one. So our responsibility, I think, is to communicate properly what's going on and what's happening. As I said before, it's always a question of the benefits versus the risks. Scientists and companies, I think, should do their best to ensure to the best possible confidence that when they say that a vaccine is efficacious and safe, that they have done the studies to confirm that. But like I said, you have rare side effects which you do not see when you've tested 10, 20 or 30,000 people. But when you have vaccinated 500,000 or 1 million people, you might start seeing things which you did not observe initially. And so it's really important in the initial stages of introduction of the vaccine, post-licensure, that we have what is called the pharmacovigilance systems, the safety monitoring and reporting systems in place, exactly to pick up the kind of signals that you mentioned. Let's hope that some of these vaccine platforms that I mentioned are tried and tested platforms which have been used for other vaccines that are commonly used in human beings. And so we have more confidence on those platforms on the safety side. So that gives us a lot of confidence. When you have new platforms, you have to be even more careful about these when you use new technologies in people. So it's really preparation, which is what we've started doing now, preparing for the scenario where you will be introducing a new vaccine. We've done this in the past. When I was in India, I remember we did this for rotavirus. There was a lot of some concern that rotavirus vaccines oral rotavirus vaccines could lead to intussusception, a rare condition in children, but serious condition. So the way it was introduced was that we did it in a few states first with careful monitoring. There were hospitals that were monitoring the incidence of intussusception in children because that was the expected severe side effect. And only when it was clear that there was no such association was it then scaled up to the rest of the country. So this has been done with vaccines in the past, and we can anticipate the kind of side effects that could occur from these different platforms and set up systems to monitor that. Second part of the question was about how to convince people to take them, but I think that's related to the safety. I've forgotten. It was almost a philosophical question.
Gunilla, can you repeat your question, the second one, or are you okay with the response already?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Gunilla? Yes, we can.
What was the second part? I forgot.
The question was on when you have developed and maybe produced billions of vaccines, how worried are you that the virus have developed the
mutations?
Infected? You have to start from scratch again.
Yeah.
Again, it's a question, very good question, something that we need to monitor. We cannot predict. So far, what we've seen from the virus genome, and luckily people are depositing the whole genome sequences in public gene banks, which we can see like GISAID and some of the others, GenBank. We have more than 40,000 virus sequences now that scientists are constantly analyzing. Of course, there are drifts in the sequence. All viruses mutate all the time. Luckily, this virus seems to be mutating less than the influenza virus, much, much less. And it yet hasn't shown any mutations in the key areas which are either linked to severity of disease or linked to the immune response. So far, most of the vaccines are targeting the spike protein, so that's the key part of the virus that we are watching. We don't know if it will mutate, and our vaccine development program will then have to adapt itself. That for influenza, we have a process where every year there are strains that are collected from around the world, and then the vaccine is based on the changes in those strains. So we don't know if that will be the case, but so far, fingers crossed, it hasn't happened for this virus. And so we're okay, but one needs to keep an eye certainly on that because it can have a big impact. So maybe this is something that for the future.
So we will take a last question. Yes. Thank you for taking the time, Dr. Soumya. From Kate Killand, Reuters. Kate, can you hear us?
Hello, yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly. Go ahead, Kate, and welcome from London, I guess.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much indeed for taking my question. I'm interested in what you said about looking at the interim data on the HIV drugs that are with it being looked at within a solidarity trial. Are you looking at that to see whether you should continue with the trial or possibly swap other patients into that arm from the hydroxychloroquine arm?
Yeah. So, as I said, we started off with 5 arms. We had the standard of care arm, the remdesivir arm, the hydroxychloroquine arm, and 2 arms which had lopinavir, ritonavir, one with and one without interferon. And those were selected based, as I said, on past knowledge of these drugs and its effect on the SARS coronaviruses. So, currently, we know that the recovery trial, which I said is very similar to the solidarity trial, is also enrolling patients in to lopinavir, ritonavir. So between solidarity and recovery, we've already enrolled about, I think, over 3,000 patients into the lopinavir, ritonavir arm. and similar number into standard of care. So this is already a huge number and should be enough to tell us whether this drug is actually having a mortality benefit or a benefit in reducing the severity of the illness. So the executive committee of our trial, the Solidarity trial, basically is looking at ways to maximize the generation of knowledge and moving into drugs which are promising. So for the drug remdesivir, we still do not have a definitive answer on its impact on mortality, which is what we would like to see. We know that it reduces the duration of hospitalization. The NIH trial showed that. There was a reduction of about 35%. We also know from a trial done by Gilead that 10 days of treatment is equal to 5 days of treatment. But what we don't know is whether it has a mortality benefit, and that's most important thing to know for public health. So that is why we would like, and I think Solidarity is right now the largest trial and the only trial to be looking at mortality for this drug, for remdesivir. So we would like to make sure that we enroll enough patients to answer that question. And if we have enough patients already enrolled into the lopinavir-ritonavir arm, between recovery and Solidarity, we feel that that question will be answered. And so we might, our committee is considering options as to what to do next with the remaining arms of Solidarity. And as I said, then we look ahead and look at whether there are other drugs coming up that we might want to look at. So we will come back very soon on the further decisions on the Solidarity trial. It's an adaptive design. I think it was a good way to set up a trial like this so that you change and adapt as you go on, but sticking to the core scientific principles and ethical principles of any clinical trial should do.
Thank you, Dr. Swaminathan, and I apologize if we were not able to take everyone on the call. It's already 1 hour. We will be sending you the audio file just shortly after we wrap up. Thank you, Dr. Swaminathan, for taking the time to explain all these technical and complex issues. And if you have any follow-up questions, don't hesitate to contact me, and see you in the near future. Thank you, and have a nice day.